So hello and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along tonight. Our plan tonight is to talk specifically about how you go about planning GCSEs. So previously as HEQA, we've done a few other webinars that cover the basic process of how it works taking GCSEs as a home educator, how you go about choosing what subjects and specifications you want to do, and a whole bunch of other questions that came up along the line. There's a link in the chat to that. If you're watching it on the replay, you're on that channel. You can go back and have a look at any of those. So if you want to, we're kind of mostly going to assume you've done those bits, you know roughly what you're doing. And tonight we're going to talk about how you take that idea that I want to take maths in 2 years and make it actually happen. So the key things we're going to talk about to do that is a little bit about the big picture. So how you might arrange how many exams you're doing at a time, those sorts of decisions. A bit about the resources that you can use to help you figure out what it is that you need to do and give yourself an idea about some timings. How you break that down into your actual plan for what you're going to learn and when. And then Sarah and I can talk through a little bit about the way that we do this, or if you've got questions, we'll sort of see how it goes in terms of how many questions we've got, what time we've got, what's the most useful thing for you guys here to learn about. Okay, yeah, there definitely will be Q&A, and we're not restricting that Q&A to just planning questions. If you have other things, put them in. We may put you towards one of the previous webinars if it's been covered more fully then. But if there's any questions, just ask. If you're wondering about something, somebody else will be as well. So don't be afraid at all to ask. All right, do you want to move on to the next slide, Sarah?
Do you want me to take over? I'm still letting people in, by the way. So
let's go ahead. Yeah, my voice is slightly going.
I'm still distracted. So when it comes to sitting exams, you do not have to do 10 or 11 at age 16. You don't have to do that many. You don't have to do any. You can start them early. You can finish late. It is totally up to you. One of the questions that comes up is, how do you know they're ready? And to be honest, that is it's a difficult question. I think most of us have found that the best way to know if they're ready is to start studying. They'll either thrive on it, or you'll realise you've got to go slower and go backwards. And take longer over it. How long per subject? That is another question. That is, how long is a piece of string? You'll read it on the group, some people saying they've done ones in weeks. That isn't the norm. For me personally, we have done them anything between 3 years and 4 months. It has been totally dependent on the subject and in the situation that we found ourselves and how much time we've had to work on that subject. We have found we got quicker with time. So generally, the guided learning hours are 120 to 130 estimated per GCSE. So over a year, that tends to work out roughly about 4 hours a week. So some people will find they need more, some people will find they need less. Remember, you are one-to-one, it's quite different. How many at a time? Again, that depends on your child. The most we've done is 6 in a year, which was quite tight. So that's not, others have done more, many only do about 2. So what is right for you? And again, some of it is trial and error. You can start one or two, decide to sit one of them the following year because it's too much work and you want to slow down. Again, It comes with prior knowledge and skills. As I mentioned, we've got quicker as my son has got older, and also when they've built on previous knowledge.
Yeah, and we found that, and it doesn't always have to be the same subject knowledge, just the knowledge of how you take an exam and what is required. So we've kind of found we can do more and do them quicker as they get older and they've got a couple under their belt.
Yeah, skills definitely transfer across subjects. I tutor a range of subjects, and I found last year I had one subject that was really tight in the time, but fortunately for me, the students were doing other subjects with me. I was just like saying, and as we did in this subject, this is how you learn to write this essay. It does help. Essay writing skills particularly carry over from one subject to another. Some of it's subject knowledge does as well. We did economics after business, and that worked really quite well. There was a lot of following on knowledge there.
And things like math skills will come into a number of other subjects, and so how strong you are on the maths will affect how much you've got to learn essentially extra for the other subjects. So it all sort of plays in together. Yeah. And when these things are all sort of things to be aware of when you're planning. So if somebody said, oh, I can do this in 4 months, that might have been the only exam they were doing. If you're planning to do 6 exams at the same time, you're going to have that much less time to spend on each one of them. So all these things play together in working out overall how many things you'll be doing at a time and how much time you've got to spend on each of them.
Yeah, and there's certain things such as English. Some people say that he'd outweigh learn the essay skills, and that can work. What worked for mine though, because he hated English, was to learn the essay skills on subjects that he enjoyed. So cutting his teeth on history and sociology got him a good grade on English because he picked up valuable skills from those. So again, it all plays together, and there is truly no right answer. It is, it's very much trial and error as home educators. It's very much getting to know your child and what they need. And it's not being afraid to change plans. Both Katie and I will tell you that we were probably on a plan M at the very because we were both very much caught up in the exam cancellations and deferrals. We've had children change their mind over subjects. We've had exams cancelled. We've had centres not take. It all happens, and just try not to panic and go with the flow a little bit really does help.
The big thing to remember is that you don't have to have done them all at 16. And many kids will want to because that's what they know they would have done in school. They're ready for that next step, but you don't have to. So if it's just not coming together, there is no rush. You can take those exams anytime. You can take another year, settle in, get it all sorted, and then be ready to move on to college. There aren't those hard and fast times and rules that you need to stick to. There's no emergencies. It's okay.
So resources though, when it comes to planning. So the key one is always the specification. I've got a few open to show different types of them. So I've stuck to the big boards. I haven't got OCR or EduCast or anything here at the moment. So we'll stick to some of the big ones, otherwise we'll spend all night looking at specs. So specification, we'll start with physics. That's a nice simple-ish one. Is exam board websites. You'll find them linked on there. So this is Pearson, who runs EdExcel, GCSE and iGCSEs. You can either go directly to the site, or Katie mentioned the wiki. You look on here, page such as, I guess that one. You can find links to the specifications, basic summary, and a few other bits of information about resources, textbooks. So this is very, very useful as a first point of just scanning what's available. It is, though, maintained by home educators, voluntary. So it does rely on home educators pooling their knowledge and adding content. So not every page is as up to date as it could be. The subjects area is nearly completely done. I have spent quite a lot of the summer updating the subjects area, and it's nearly all in this standard with textbooks and stuff linked. But as soon as I do it, they change something somewhere along the lines, and the specs I haven't added, like marine science, yet. I will get there with that one, but there's always little bits of changes. But as a first course, it can give you an idea of what subjects are available and links to the specifications. As you get more practice, you'll just get used to going straight to the exam board website and finding it, because you'll have it.
Yeah, and the exam board specification page, is the ultimate. If the two of them conflict, then go for the specification on the exam board website. That's the most up to date, the right knowledge, essentially.
Yeah. So what you have on here is lots of resources. We'll look at the teaching and learning materials and the exam materials in a minute. But this is your key document, the specification. So what it does.
And somebody asked in the chat about how to find the exam code for Edexcel. That was on the front page there. Just want to show Sarah.
It isn't on the front page. Oh, yes, it is there.
There you are.
I have changed it,
it's the in the brackets there, the 4PH1. They will have slightly different formats. I think AQA is a 4-digit code. So CAIE, but it will be, there'll be a code like that, and that's the specification code.
And you do get used to recognizing the way it's done. I can guess Edexcel codes now, because they've got
Edexcel have got quite a standard format. Some of the others are just random numbers, as far as I can tell.
So originally I spent a lot of time looking at them, and you can usually make a guess of what they are now. So there's usually quite a bit of information that is mostly not really relevant. It's all about, but then it tells you about the course. So what it will tell you is unique to that particular course. This one particularly is quite interesting because it outlays the way Edexcel sciences work, and this is quite a nice little chart that tells you about it. But we'll skip over for that because we've talked about the sciences in a previous video. If anybody's interested, they can go back. So qualification at a glance. This tells you how the exams are structured, basically, what you're assessed on. When they're available.
Useful things there are that they're written exams, which series they're in. So GCSEs are only ever available in the summer. International GCSEs usually have another sitting as well, not all of them, but many of them, which for Edexcel, it has been in January. The last January series is going to be this one coming 2023, and then it's moving to have that second series being in November. And Cambridge have always been in November. They say November, and actually the exams are often October, but it's an autumn series.
We'll probably see a new spec coming out, and it might just be that the only difference is the fact that it's not going to say January anymore. So they're going to have to update all of them. And then they outlay the content. How they do it depends on the different specs. So you can see what this is a list of what you have to know. It doesn't tell you how to study it, just simply what you have to know. For science, it's quite practical. You can see they've got some of the formulas in there. You can see they say practicals. For science, you need to know the practicals, not necessarily do them, but you need to know them. And they're listed in the specs, the ones that you need to know about.
And for physics, and there may be other ones. So because there's the way that the Edexcel do sciences is the double science contains about 2/3 of the same as content as the physics. So the regular type is the one that's also in double science, and the ones that are in bold type with a P after them are only in the single science. I mean, there's a couple of other specs. If they've got a foundation and a higher tier, they may lift those out separately. They may do it in a similar way where they've got bolded sections or italic sections that are only involved in one of the tiers. But they will say all of that up at the beginning of the spec.
Let's flip through a couple of others quite quickly, because you can see the way the sciences are, like the way they're laid out are quite differently depending on the subject and the exam board, because what you need to know is quite different. So Cambridge, what these refer to, we notice on Edexcel, they call it the 2017. That's because when it was first starting to teach, it was first assessed in 2019, it was the same spec. Cambridge tend to tweak theirs ever so slightly, a bit more often. The key with Cambridge to know how much changes they are is have a look at the published resources. And they tend to tell you if there's new books available. If there's new books, that tends to tell you there's more changes to the spec than they also do list in their specification the changes, so you can see that nice and straightforward. But having a look to see if there's a new book is usually a good idea of getting a gist of whether there's a good idea. So you need to know with these when you are sitting the exams for Cambridge. Look at 2013 spec, you see English. Again, you've got the simplest level, how the assessment works. You'll notice for this, they actually have an option for coursework. Diversifying slightly, you often hear that GCSEs don't have coursework. Some of them do, but for a lot of them, you don't have to do the coursework. So for this one, you can do paper 1 and paper 2, so 2 exams. You don't have to do the coursework. So once you've got that, you've looked at that, you've worked that out, you can read the subject content. So you can see that actually for English, it is just 2 pages listing quite broad definitions of what you have to learn. You often learn more about what you need to do by picking apart what the assessment is. So the ones I need to see. History GCSE. I've chosen this one because there's options in it. And no, I've sort of stuck in a way to ones that I know quite well. These are ones that I sort of digested the specs of quite. So history will tell you that you take one of the following options. So their specification is huge because they list all the content for all of these. But for this paper, there's 4 different possible papers you can sit and you choose which one. So when you're looking at the subject, the content in the specification, you are just picking out the units that matter to you. So again, they are, how they look depends on the subject. We can see they've all looked ever so slightly different. And it's just a case of getting used to what they are. HEQA Sociology. HEQA do this thing where they do a specification at a glance. I wouldn't say use this as a humane resource, but it could be quite handy as the first line to actually scan. You can see it on the page. OCR do it as well, I think, that you can just scan through and read it without downloading. But Again, assessments, and then details of what you need to know. What I've not scanned to the back of each one is, but depending on the subject, they will give you extra information. So sociology, if you go to the back, you've got things such as appendix, which lists the key studies and information about them. You have glossaries that tell you the key terms. You quite often have a list of command words. So these specifications, they are the starting blocks. This is what you are planning from.
And one thing that's actually at the end of all the specifications is it usually says something about private candidates, which is the way that home educators generally take exams. You sometimes have to take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. Occasionally there's a specification that it says you can't take as a private candidate, which is just a hard and fast rule. You can't take as a private candidate. You might be able to find a centre that will let you sit it, using teaching through them. But they will often say that most of them will say that they're available for private candidates. That doesn't always mean it's easy, because there can also still be practical and coursework requirements that will make it very hard to find a centre. So although the exam board says you can, you still need to find that centre that's going to help you to do so. If it's just a written exam paper, generally that is the easiest thing to be able to access. And sometimes they have hidden practical requirements in the spec. So you look at the qualification and it says it's all just written papers and that's fine. But then somewhere in the back, they say, but the exam centre needs to sign off to say you've done a 20-hour project under supervision or something. So it is worth just flicking through those and being sure what the requirements really are.
So you start from the specification. A lot of it, first reading, until you get used to them, is quite difficult to get your head around what they're asking, because most of us aren't teachers. So it's start from the specification, download it, read it. What is often very useful for home educators is how you're going to study it then. And this is where a lot of people do their planning from. So you're using a student book, textbook, course. So using those as your base. Is it possible to study without a student book? The groups will tell you no and always go for the student book. It is. If you go to the spec and follow that to the letter, that is telling you what you need to teach. The books are written, and the idea is if you study the book, you will learn everything you need. If they're endorsed book, that is what the exam board has said. But it is always still worth checking stuff off against the specification. I think for wordier subjects, particularly, that's the reason why I picked sociology and history, because I read the textbooks and they're useful, but sometimes they don't cover things in as much depth as the specification leads me to believe that they need to know. So I treat the specification as a tick list to make sure that we've covered it. Other resources you can use, schemes of work. So let me find sociology, because that was, they had one on there. I saw that, teacher resources. So lots of subjects have them, not everyone. So not all of them are that useful. So it's about picking and choosing whether they're useful for you, because the key to remember with these is they are written for schools. They are written for classroom teachers, delivering the subject in 2 or 3 years with a group of 30 children. So that is not how we work as home educators. So the chances are a scheme of work isn't going to suit what you need exactly. But it can give you an idea of how to get through the content and how to spend, how long you need to spend on different bits of it.
You can't always tell that from the spec. It can have one point, you know, that says understand this one thing that actually is really complicated and you can spend, you know, weeks on, and another point that's really quick. So you can't just divide up the number of points in the specification and spend an equal time on them. So having a look through a scheme of work or a textbook or something like that can just give you more of an idea of which ones are the really meaty topics, which ones are quite quick, and how you can group those together sensibly.
And they sometimes have extra resources and links into other bits. Particularly useful, I've not done this, is ones where there actually isn't a textbook for that specification. And sometimes the specification, sometimes the scheme of work is what you've got to teach from, and you're pulling the information out from that. So there aren't many subjects that don't have a textbook, but there are the odd one. So that's one example of a scheme of work. We'll look at other stuff on the example website in a minute. I'm keeping an eye on the time. So what else have we got? Subject-specific Facebook groups. So most subjects now have groups on Facebook that are dedicated to parents studying them. And a lot of them are aimed at people self-studying. If you join the exams group, or if you're on the exams group, there's a list in the files that I put together of groups of different groups. I think between Katie and I, we probably admin a decent proportion of the ones on there. But they are useful. They are people that have studied the spec. Quite often there's home educators on there who have gone on to tutor it because they've developed a love for it. So they share resources. You can have a look in the files. Some of them have guides. So it really does depend on who's using them, about what there is on there, because they rely on people contributing. But some of them can be really useful. There's one, take for example, the business studies group. I put an entire scheme of work for HEQA economics on there because there is no textbook for that one. So because I planned it for my son, I put it in the guides on there. So it's there for other people to refer to.
And you can often ask specific questions as well. If you sort of say, my son's struggling with this question, the answer in the back says this, I don't understand why. Put that up there, people will come and help you out. It's all very friendly.
Particularly the maths ones.
Okay, I'll do that in maths.
The maths group is full of people that like answering maths questions. But yeah, other groups as well. People will help with the marketing. They'll say, in some cases, that's wrong, the textbook's wrong. Revision and versus teaching materials. There's a lot of revision resources out there. The likes of Seneca, Bite Size, CGP for most books. The only ones they've got is textbooks and maths. They are good textbooks for maths, but everything else is revision resources. They are not enough on their own. They can be quite useful. They can be very useful, particularly if you're pushed for time. But they tend to be after you studied the main material. They're not enough to cover it from scratch. You will find most specifications have an endorsed textbook that you can access. Like I said, the wiki has links to a lot of them. Different exam boards have, depending on the board itself, they all have access to where you can find. HEQA, of course, doesn't.
Resource list.
History does some of that. You can have a look. You can see some of their published resources. Other specs do it, so they haven't got all of them. Cambridge, again, you can have a look. Published resources. And it takes you to textbooks.
And there will often, particularly for the more popular subjects, there'll be multiple different textbooks that you can choose from. and that is just personal preference. You know, if they say endorsed on them somewhere, they will cover the whole course, and it's just a different style. So it depends which book you like the way that they present it best. And there's no particular benefit to choosing the book that's published by the same people as the exam board. It's fine to choose one from a different publisher if that's what you like better.
You will find that people fall into habits which ones they use. Yeah. I wax lyrical that I don't like Pearson books, but that is, I tend to stay away from them now. They might even be really good. I've just gone down other routes if there's one, but there's no reason why. If they're endorsed, they cover the spec. It's visual layout, a lot of it.
Because the textbook's quite specialised, you often won't be able to find them like in your local W.H. Smith's or something, but they're almost all available on Amazon, and they usually have a look inside, so you can have a bit of a look to see what the pages are like. If you're still not sure, you can ask on the Facebook exams group and people will give you their opinion. Might not help because they'll all give you different opinions. Might be able to show you some pages from inside it as well to give you an idea of what the books are like.
I'm going to jump onto the question about past papers since I've got them open. So on this page, so you've got teaching and learning materials. So you've got lots of other stuff here, guides, etc., schemes of work, extra resources.
Topic support or something similar to that on Edexcel is often well worth a look. They don't cover everything, but they do often have some topics that they've got extra guides on that they've got really quite helpful.
Yeah, and they're starting to add more and more, I think.
Yeah.
The last year.
And some of the other exam boards, well, OCR had some really useful, good extra stuff.
HEQA has as well. So even if you're not doing that spec, but they're very similar, you can have a look at the resources. As long as when you're looking at exam questions, you focus on the spec you're doing. Content, if you're looking for something to teach a particular idea, you can look beyond the specification you're doing. It's just when it comes to practice exam questions, stick to your own spec. But exam materials, exam papers. So you'll see, let's have a look at this one. I always have this panic when I'm logged in. Now, so you can see they've got a little lockpick by them. That's because at the moment they're locked. So we can't access these ones. They're kept aside for mocks. So Edexcel, you will also notice for their IGCSEs have a 1P and a 1PR. Not for every sitting, there's been some confusions lately, but for most, R means regional. They are the same specification that was just sat in a different part of the world. They have more than one paper to make for different time zones because they're international qualifications. Cambridge for most have 3. Cambridge numbering system confused me, but if you look on the wiki, there's a good explanation of it. I just have to read that explanation every single time I want to use Cambridge paper. If I'm doing the subject, it's fresh in my mind. It's just if I've not looked recently and I haven't, I forget. Theirs is 2 digits. I should just not. I can't remember which is the paper and which is the area code. Ones which are, and then you can see if they're unlocked, there's no.
So there's a question in the chat about do they ever unlock them? The answer is yes. There used to be a very fixed schedule where they would kind of keep the last year's locked and unlock everything before that. Because over COVID, they started using past papers, or they had to use past papers as a basis for grading, then it's moved to a point where more of them are locked. There's sort of a constant level of negotiations about how many they can unlock publicly and whether there's any ways we can get the unlocked papers. So it's a little bit in flux, but there will be some unlocked. And even for new specifications, they have to have a sample assessment material, which is usually in the same place as the specification. So there will always be at least one available.
There's more for more the GCSEs are unlocked.
Yes, there's only the last one.
The edit cell. Cambridge, you'll find that there's very few on their page, but if you go to sites, there's quite a few listed on the wiki. Papa Cambridge is one, pastpapers.co. Cambridge papers tend to be leaked a lot, and they seem to have stopped trying to chase them up. So you can usually get your hand on Cambridge papers. Generally with edit cell, I would advise not getting your hands on locked papers. They have schemes where you can access them through the exam board, through exam centres and the exam board. It didn't necessarily work extremely well this year, but teething troubles, hopefully it will in future. Lessons get learned by all of these, and hopefully they will just unlock more as we've now got a few exam series under our belt post-COVID that we're getting there. Yeah. Do I think it's necessary to pay out for tutors? No. Straightforward, no. It depends on everybody's situation. There's a whole host of reasons why you might choose to use a tutor. And I will say that I work as an exam centre as a tutor. So, but do I think it's necessary for everyone? No, not necessarily. Resources and books. We used, my youngest did 10 subjects. We used a tutor group for one. When we were actually discussing it Thursday night post the last results, I hadn't realised this, but my husband pointed out that that subject, which he was also responsible for the revision, I totally wiped my hands on that one, is actually the lowest grade. So we did have a little bit of a chuckle about that one. If you are using books and other resources, what is key is time. It's the motivation of the student. If they are very keen themselves to actually get on, learn it, that is brilliant. I think most of us realise that are blessed with kids that are totally and utterly self-motivated. Mine needed pushing up that hill. So for me, it took a lot of my time. I had to plan. I had to make sure he was on top of the work. I had to learn how to mark the papers, and it is possible to learn how to mark the papers even if you're not an expert. It gets easier year by year. The first one was petrifying, and there are things such as you might not use a tutor for the entire course, but you might choose to get a couple of exam papers marked. That's what I did for English. So what I wanted to know is, was my marking in the rough ballpark? I didn't want to be predicting him that he was getting 9s and actually they were marking him as 4s or something like that. So that was helpful. We weren't exactly right for something like English, it's subjective. But when we actually compared what I'd marked it as and what they had, we decided it was good enough to be in that we were getting the idea.
And it can depend both on your child's interest and on your interests and what you're comfortable with. So some people, we've used group classes in particular for things like English and also for history, where I just wasn't as confident on the marking. And also I thought they would benefit from being able to discuss it with a group of people. So we've not used one-to-one tutors for anything, but within that group. So I've used that for some subjects, and then other subjects we've just been us and the textbook, and that's worked out really well. So it's, again, there's no hard and fast rules. It's about what suits you for the family, but it's absolutely possible to do it.
Yeah. With
the textbooks, with the resources, and time, and sitting down and looking at what you've got available to you and making use of it. Another quick question about how can you get papers marked? So there's a couple of ways. There are some companies that just do marking papers. In fact, there's one called Mark My Papers. There's also tutors. So if you can find people who would do one-to-one tutoring, they also do a service where they'll just do like kind of a one-off marking a paper, giving you some feedback on it.
the thing is, you don't need to get every single paper marked.
Absolutely.
I mean, if I'd got every single English paper we did marked, I think I'd have needed to remortgage the house. It was.
And if you think about what happens in a school, they do one mock and they get a mark back for that. And you know, not every teacher in a school actually is experienced in exam marking either. So it's not that you're sort of desperately missing out if you're only having that one level of external feedback.
Yeah, that is very true. Being on exam group, being on teachers subject groups during the last couple of years where they've been discussing the marking, they're not experts either, a lot of them. So don't feel that you are necessarily, if you're putting in the effort to learn, that is what you need to be doing. Knowing it at the start isn't necessarily essential, and you're not actually doing your child that much of a disservice, because there are ways of learning it. So things like the examiners reports, the mark schemes are available, asking for advice on subject specific exam groups. Just private companies like Mark My Papers, or finding a private tutor that will ways you can get papers marked. Some subjects are easier to do than others. Maths, sciences tend to be right or wrong. English, history tend to be quite subjective. There's some subjects which are do benefit from somebody who knows a little bit more, things like history, the styles of answering the question. But one of the best ways to that is YouTube videos. If you look at how to answer a certain question on YouTube, there are YouTube videos to help, and some of them are good. Timescales. So how to go about planning is look at how much time you've got available. So how many weeks have you got to study the course? How many days a week do you want to be working? When do you want to finish it by? So I think I read Katie's notes, and we will actually do pretty much the same thing with this, is if they were studying in a year, we would probably work on the content up until about Easter time, because it's still quite fresh. From about January, I would start revising already what I've done from September alongside. But from about Easter, that's when I would move into exam papers and the other things. If it was a 2-year course, I would probably look to finish around February half term to allow a bit more time for revision of content. So again, I'm looking at Katie's notes. I think I do exactly the same with this, so I'm going to work for this. So what I would say is one of the ways we do it is we work for the content quite quickly at first. So going over every bit. And then I tend to go through the CGP books, if they've got them, quite quickly to get the content in again, or a different revision book. And this is where you find that sometimes they haven't learned things the first time round, and you have to go back and look at the other books again, or a different way. But it comes up. And then go through past papers. How long you will spend on past papers will depend on how many papers you've got available. Don't stress if there's only a few. There are different ways of doing it. So there are usually, as long as you are practicing exam questions, then you are fine. So I was actually in training with OCR for a subject last year, and they actually pointed out to me that using past papers in a way, those questions are dead. They will never be asked that same question again. So it's a useful thing to do, practice past papers. Of course it is. You're practicing the style of exam questions, you're practicing the level of exam questions, you're getting used to what you are going to see in the exam. But you're never going to get that same question again. So practice exam questions as well. So however you find them. So,
and this is also partly you need different techniques for different subjects. Because I would say in maths and science, while you might not get precisely the same question again, you do often start to see similar sorts of questions cropping up and similar sorts of, answers that they want in the mark scheme. Not for everything, but there's kind of a few things you're like, right, okay, this is a standard one. It's worth just learning that phrasing, and it will almost always be from the spec as well. So something like maths, actually just going through lots and lots of past papers and looking at what was missed, what they couldn't do, and then focusing in on a couple of those things and then going back over a past paper can be a really good technique, because maths also kind of covers pretty much everything in each exam. Not completely, but probably a good 80% of the spec is covered over one maths exam.
And to be honest,
whereas for an essay subject, that can be very different.
We used a similar technique for everything, even essay. So English, we would do a paper, mark it, and redo it, because to see what he'd learned about the technique, because it was that practicing and trying to bring it together. And that worked really quite well for us. So go back to the planning. Once you've worked out how long you've got to study for, you've worked out when you're going to try and finish it for, allow a couple of extra weeks. So take Christmas off. Expect to get sick. You will get sick at some point. Somebody will come and visit you at a totally inappropriate time. So make sure you allow a couple of contingency weeks at least in your planning. And then chunk it out. So it might be that you're using the textbook as your frame of reference. Divide your chapters into the number of weeks you've got to study. If you're not using your a textbook as the main thing, chunk out the spec. Work out where you need to be in certain points of a course you're doing. But use that reference of, we need to be here at this point, because it's very easy to get caught up into spending too long on something. And do it, move on. You can always go backwards.
You almost certainly won't stick to it day by day, week by week, but you sort of want to have every 6 weeks or so a check-in to say, are we about on track? Are we way behind? Or actually, are we ahead and we can spend a bit more time on things? So have that idea of whereabouts you need to be.
Yeah, and that's it. And if you built in those contingency weeks, if it turns out you don't need them, they are catch-up weeks. And that's how I've used them as well. It's trying to do your best on keeping on track.
And even if you have a child that doesn't really want you to be very involved in what they're doing, it's worth having some check-ins, because I think quite a few parents have had a child who sort of says, yeah, I'm doing it, I'm all fine. And then it comes quite close to the exam and you finally check in, and actually that isn't the case.
Yeah.
So it is worth keeping an eye as you go along, even if they're doing a course, just double check that it is all progressing as you'd hope.
Yeah, home ed tutors won't email and tell you they are not handing in homework. Particularly if it's sort of online courses, you don't know if they're actually there a lot of the time, if they haven't switched on videos. You're sort of relying on the fact that they're listening as a tutor, so they won't necessarily, it's still your responsibility. So you need to be checking in that they're actually doing the work that's required of them and looking at it. So what are they being told for feedback? So learn from it. We covered a little bit about the way we do it. You will find that if you ask for questions on the group, everybody will give you different ways of planning. So there's certain similarities that come through that a lot of us do. That idea of working out how many weeks you've got and then splitting up the content. I think that's a fairly standard approach of doing it. But there is no one right way of doing planning. It is really just feeling your way into it, what works for you. Some people are a bit more structured than others in their plans. I like to have targets of when we will get through each bit of content. Otherwise, particularly for the likes of sociology or history, wordier subjects, it's very easy to think, well, I haven't covered this because it's so big a topic. So you feel like you're just scratching the surface of something. But actually, at GCSE level, that is all actually you need to be doing for quite a few of the subjects. So,
and it depends on what your child responds to as well. You know, I was pretty relaxed, and then actually my kid said, "No, I want to know what I'm supposed to do each week. Like, just tell me precisely what I need to do each week, then I can do it, and I know I'm done." Whereas if you kind of go, "Oh, we're just going to talk about this now," then they felt that they didn't know when the end was, and they wanted to know that. So they've asked for the lists and the checklist, and other kids are just like, "No, look, I want to be in charge of this. I want to sort out what I'm doing." So you have to be flexible around what those needs are as well.
Yeah, mine needed to be told what to do, but not in too structured a way. What I used to do was do all the planning, but didn't show it to him because he didn't want to know. He didn't need to know in that detail. And then we had an academic diary, and I would write in every day what I needed him to do that day. So we didn't have a timetable of we do X subject on this day or for this hours or what have you. It was specific tasks. At various times he got a little bit more self-motivated. I managed to give him jobs for the week, but that didn't always work. So we went back to days, and he needed me to be kept on track of, have you done it? Are you answering the question about the textbooks?
I am, yes, I'm just typing in.
So we'll open up to questions. Anybody's got any more?
So how do you find out which centres in the area to sit the exams? Again, the first two main places. The first place to look is on the exams wiki. There's quite a few centres listed there. Also ask around locally, because that's always your best bet. It does change frequently. So sometimes there's areas, there's a private centre, then that's great, you know where they are, you can always access them. Sometimes it's a school who sort of will sometimes offer it and sometimes won't. So your two best resources are to ask local home educators and to check on the exams wiki. And then there's a list of centres to try in each area.
Yes, it's possible to do GCSE art, but it isn't cheap. And it needs to be done at only a few centres will do it, and you need to work with their tutor. So if you go through the wiki and the subjects list, there's an art page, and that lists centres that I've come across that do it. Tutors and Exams do it. There's one up north, Durham. Some people even go to France. Fairgoss does it. So there are options to do it, but you need to make sure you've got that link between tutor and exam centre, and expect to pay, unfortunately, because you're paying a highly qualified tutor to monitor the course.
Yeah, and to travel for the exam centre as well. You may well have to be on site for a certain number of sessions.
Yeah, sessions. Some of them will often do some online, but you still have to go in person for some of them. And then you've got a big long exam that's about 10 hours.
And there are some alternatives, so it depends on what you need it for. Some people will look at things like the Arts Awards, which is not the same as a GCSE, but it can be another way to sort of get a recognised qualification that works in some creative areas.
As to know whether to do GCSE or IGCSE, well, that's there are only a few that have to be IGCSEs, and even that half is a bit vague. You always come across people that have done it as GCSE, but generally sciences, because of the practical endorsement that needs to be done for GCSE, need to be IGCSE. Geography, because of the field work, needs to be IGCSE. Computer science generally needs to be IGCSE and Cambridge usually. The usual variation, but in terms of ease, the most likelihood of finding the centre, that's true of those. English language is starting to be a bit iffier. It used to be very much that had to be IGCSE, and it's still a safer option to do it as IGCSE, but there are more places that offer that as GCSE now. But you are still usually better in terms of finding an exam centre doing the IGCSE, and to be honest, quite often having a look at the difference in the specs, IGCSE seems to suit a lot of children a little bit more than some of the GCSEs for English language specifically. You have to make these decisions by subject. Other quick questions?
Yeah, I mean, other than that, I think you can use GCSE for others. Another reason that pushes people towards IGCSE sometimes is it has that second sitting, and sometimes people want to use that, so that can be a reason for choosing it. It can be different options, it can just be a different way that the exams are organised. So for instance, for maths, the IGCSE has 2 slightly longer exams, whereas the GCSE has 3, and that can be a difference if you've got a long travel to an exam centre. So again, on the HE exams wiki for each subject, it will list through the different specifications and, you know, tell you some of the differences and which ones you can choose between.
And for a lot, it's personal choice. We've done probably more GCSEs than IGCSEs, but I think that's tied into the fact that we've self-studied for more of them. So there are more resources out there for GCSE quite often, I found, for the subjects we've done, at least.
And if you are using a tutor or a course, they will usually be geared towards a specification, so that might be a reason for choosing one over another as well. I've got a question about somebody going into year 9. Would it be worth going straight into GCSE textbooks or doing Key Stage 3? I mean, that partly depends on your child and what you think they're ready for. Generally, I would go straight to GCSE and perhaps just do it a little bit slower if you need to cover more of the Key Stage 3 as you go along.
But also at the same time, don't be tied by school years.
Yeah.
If it depends if they've just come out of school, if they've not attended for a while, and they might not be working at year 9 level, you might get better going backwards. But don't also, again, it is just what works for your child. But generally at year 9, I would look at GCSE resources and just go slower.
And to sort of be aware the difference between Key Stage 3 and GCSE, I mean, they often circle around and cover things. So it's not that there's a hard and fast, this is Key Stage 3, and you must do all of that, and then you must go on to GCSE. They sort of smooth over and overlap a lot more than that. If GCSE will cover more of the Key Stage 3 skills, top of Key Stage 3 will kind of be similar things that you're doing at GCSE. It's all just a gradual progression. And in skills-based subjects, it's just similar skills at a slightly more complex level. Sciences and maths and GCSE things will cover, again, all of the Key Stage 3. They'll just have a little bit more detail about it.
CGP revision books, double science, there isn't one. It is a case of buying the individual physics, chemistry, biology, but they do tell you which is paper 1 and which is paper 2 content in them. So you just need to look at the paper 1 content, but there isn't one revision book for it. At least there wasn't when I used it. I don't think there is now. It's a couple of years since I did science. We're sort of pretty much on time. We got any more questions? Or we done a wrap up pretty close to the time?
Yeah, sounds great. And I said we have recorded this, so it'll take a few days to go through processing and things, but we will get that up onto the YouTube channel. So if you missed anything or you want to go back and have a look, that will be available in a few days' time. I will send out to everybody I can who's registered when that goes up, so you can get those links and anything else that we think of that's useful to share. We'll send that out to you as well.
And if you've got any questions that you've not asked, scroll up, make the link of that exams group, come on and ask on there. We're both on there, and so are a lot of other helpful, knowledgeable people as well. So there'll always be people there to answer questions.